Hello. The reason I'm making this video is a result of a conversation I had with a head teacher a few years ago. I mentioned Chaucer, and his response was, Chaucer, perceived to be difficult. Now, he was a mathematician, so probably didn't have a great deal of direct experience of Chaucer. But nevertheless, that was the opinion that he was getting in his school. Now, there is very little that is difficult in the stories themselves, in the tales, and therefore the reason for the difficulty must be the language. And I'm going to give you a few simple techniques to make the Middle English in which Chaucer wrote much easier. And one thing to remember is that the language which you write and speak today may cause as much perplexity some 600 years hence as Chaucer's Middle English does for you. Now, this is a lovely setting, with the church behind me built on the site of a Norman chapel, with medieval parts, additions in the 15th and 16th centuries, and then finally the last additions in the 19th century. But nevertheless, one of the problems about making this video outside is that we have the constant hum of traffic. And since it is harvest time, quite possibly we'll be interrupted by a combine harvester or other agricultural machinery. Therefore, I'm going to continue this in the studio, where we can cut out the background noise. Another thing to think about is that when Chaucer was living at Aldgate in London, it was not quiet. For him, he would not have had the sound of background traffic, but the constant ringing of bells. There were so many churches and religious houses, and so many religious offices of the day, many of which were rung for to get the people to come to announce that they were taking place, that he would have had this constant cacophony of bells, even as he tried to write the Canterbury Tales. Just before looking at the specific techniques for approaching the language, I'd like to say that another reason why Chaucer sometimes gets a reputation for difficulty is because of where students first encounter his work. Too often it can be the General Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, which, with its long, let's be honest, long-winded opening sentence, is neither the easiest nor perhaps the most engaging place for anyone to start. Leaving any exam requirements aside, suppose that as a teacher you simply wanted to create some interest in Chaucer. Would you choose a tale or the General Prologue? A story or the descriptions of the cast? If you want to sell Chaucer to a bunch of 14-year-olds, just tell them the Miller's Tale, in your own words. Yes, it's rude, so they'll love it. Act it too, up to a point. Nicholas, staring fixedly up into the heavens, even as the carpenter breaks down the door and tries to shake him out of his trance. Absalom's high-pitched, weedy voice. It's oral poetry, performance storytelling. And the story contains perhaps the greatest meanwhile in all literature. All attention has been diverted to the goings-on with the kiss, the bottom hanging out of the window, the moment when Nicholas let flee a fart as great as it had been a thunder dent, and the red-hot poker. We get to what everyone thinks is the climax. And then you say, meanwhile, back in the barn. There is, after all, no evidence that Chaucer completed the General Prologue before he started to write some of the tales. He could have turned from one part of the project to another, as mood and inspiration took him. Obviously, the General Prologue is meant to be the opening part of the whole work, but as a modern audience unfamiliar with the language, we can just keep that in mind, coming back to the prologue when we are more familiar with the language through the storytelling, or taking on both the tale and the prologue at the same time. Anyway, have I still got your interest? Good. That's the cutesy bit done.
So what techniques can you use to make Chaucer's language easier? Here are 5. First of all, concentrate on using your ears. Secondly, read it out aloud, pronouncing it as it looks as though it should be pronounced, in the way that it is spelled. Then, listen to what you are saying. Think of it like singing, when your ears tell you whether you've hit the note correctly or are a little sharp or flat, or in my case, somewhere else completely different. Think of the writer as having the spelling skills of a small child. Try different accents. And lastly, you will have to learn a few words that have gone out of use. So, step by step. Listen. Or at very least, think of the poetry like reading a play script. It is meant to be heard, to be performed. It has an audience, not primarily a readership. Yes, some of Chaucer's work was circulated in manuscript, commissioned at high cost from a scribe, but to a very, very small number of people. No one in his lifetime could foresee the late 15th century capacities for setting type and printing books for publishing. And nearly all who could read would read aloud rather than silently. Back then, reading was an oral performance, so even as a fair copy manuscript, the work remains conceived largely for the ear. Think where there could be pauses, inflections, comic timing. And forget about spelling, because there were no dictionaries in Chaucer's day to tell him how words should be spelt. He had to guess. There were documents around, and so there was something of a consensus about spelling in local areas, but definitely not nationwide, because English differs quite a lot across the regions at that time. In 1490, Caxton, with the newly invented movable type printing press, is left wondering whether he should print Egges, E-G-G-E-S, or Eyren, E-Y-R-E-N. Such, he says, is the diversity of language. In any event, Chaucer's English is only one of 3 languages he would be accustomed to using. He also had Latin and French. Several types of French, in fact. Parisian pure French, the more locally spoken French, such as the prioress is said to speak, no doubt with an English accent, Parlez-vous français? Anglo-Norman French, with a distinctly Norman vocabulary, and also the curious mix of English and French that is called Law French, recorded in such sentences as this. Read aloud. Pronounce as it looks using modern English. It is of no use trying to imitate Chaucer's pronunciation. If he said drochthe verdrouwt, pronouncing the GH, where does that get you? Confusion. If GH in the middle of a word is not pronounced in modern English, don't do it in Chaucer's English, which has fathered modern English. You are aiming only at recognising words. That is the target, not being an expert at 14th century pronunciation. And generally treat the last E on a word, ending with E, as optional. It might change the sound, as in bit and bite, or it might not. And sometimes, where there would be a final E in modern English, it's not there in Chaucer's words. But what's an E between friends? Say words different ways if you are not sure. One of them is likely to come up a winner. Does that seem hard? Look at this. Pause the video if you want. If you can read what a small child writes with few spelling skills yet, you can read Chaucer. Context helps, of course, but just remember that Chaucer cannot really look up words and there's no on-screen spell checker. he will think of how they sound, how he might have seen them written down before, and how he normally spells them, which might or might not be the same, and if in doubt, guess, just like a small child. After all, he is writing the words down so that he himself can read them aloud, more than for publishing and other people to read, at least at the first stage of writing.